This is a special edition of Primetime Thursday. Peter Jennings reporting.
In Cairo, in Baghdad, in Dhahran, and Beirut and Damascus, in Pakistan, and in Indonesia. All over the Muslim world, more than 1 billion Muslims are waiting to see what America will do next.
We are the friends of almost 1 billion worldwide who practice the Islamic faith.
President Bush knows they are watching. Nearly every day since September the 11th, he has sent a message to them.
The enemy of America is not our many Muslim friends. It is not our many Arab friends. Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists.
Why does President Bush keep saying this?
I think the administration is quite aware that there is deep-seated suspicion in some quarters of in the Middle East towards U.S. foreign policy in the region.
Bin Laden is a smart guy. He's capitalizing or trying to capitalize on the anti-American feelings that are deeply felt in the Arab and Muslim world.
Every Muslim has a duty to stand up and fight for the victory of his religion.
How real is the danger of greater conflict between America and Islam?
I say that these events divided the whole world into two camps. A camp of faith without hypocrisy and a camp of infidels.
Even if you get rid of Osama bin Laden tomorrow, you're going to have dozens and hundreds of Osama bin Ladens all over that part of the world.
Tonight, a journey across the map of the Muslim world. A political, religious, and strategic minefield for America. Tonight, how careful the United States must be in order to win the battle against terror, without giving Osama bin Laden the greater war that he wants.
Minefield, the United States and the Muslim world. Reporting from New York, Peter Jennings.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. It has been, as you know, a month today since terrorists attacked the United States, and how much the world has changed since then. America is now at war. And that's one of the reasons that we built this huge map, so that in this next hour we may be able to better understand the complications and the challenges facing the United States, and particularly the Bush administration. The President has spoken to the nation today, and here's a little of what he had to say.
How do I respond when I see that in some Islamic countries there is vitriolic hatred for America? I tell you how I respond. I'm amazed. I'm amazed that there's such misunderstanding of what our country is about that people would hate us.
We think a great many Americans would have exactly the same reaction as President Bush, but Americans acknowledge, for the most part, they are not familiar with Islam. Take a look at a couple of statistics from a poll we have just done. 65% of people say they are unfamiliar with Islam. And as for a broader conflict with Islam as a whole, 66%, about the same percentage, are worried about a broader war with Islam, which takes us right back to the map. We built this map to give you and ourselves a sense of how enormous the Muslim world is. More than 1 billion people on the globe are Muslims, but in some respects it's so large you can't get it all into one studio. I'm standing in Afghanistan, which for now is very much the focus of attention for so many of us. But the Muslim world extends east from Afghanistan all the way to Indonesia, which doesn't make it into the studio. It's the most populous Muslim country in the world. And as we walk from east to west, there are Muslims in virtually every country. In Bangladesh, for example, which used to be part of Pakistan. In India, where there are actually almost as many, perhaps even more Muslims than there are in Pakistan. Pakistan, of course, a Muslim nation. Afghanistan, we know. Up here, just above Pakistan, are the 5 former republics of the Soviet Union with large Muslim populations, some of them interested in helping the United States in the war against terrorism, others not. China over here has a Muslim population about which it worries. Here's a country we're all familiar with, Iran. Remember the Iranian Revolution, the Muslim Revolution against the Shah of Iran? And we know something about Iraq, home of Saddam Hussein. Saudi Arabia, oil-rich, and the home of 2 of Islam's holiest places, Mecca and Medina. In Africa, the Sudan, Egypt, a long traditional ally. And here, tightly grouped together, where some of the most extreme tension in the Middle East occurs, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, the Palestinian territories here, and Israel. We'll come back to all of them. And then out across North Africa to Libya, Algeria, and beyond Algeria, Morocco. These are all states which the United States is going to have to understand better, individually and collectively, if it's going to win the war against terrorism. So many people ask today, who's the enemy? Well, to understand that, let's go back to Afghanistan. Afghanistan's been fought over for many centuries. But in 1979, the Soviet Union, for its own reasons, occupied, or tried to occupy successfully, Afghanistan. And people from all over the Muslim world were attracted to come and fight the communists. They did so with American help. By the time the Soviets had been defeated and gone home 10 years later, and the United States took much less interest, many of the people who fought here had formed very important connections. But why is the United States the enemy? Well, there are a lot of reasons, and it's very, very complicated. But one of the ones we could begin by concentrating on has to do with the Gulf War at the beginning of the 1990s. When the United States came along and put together a coalition to drive the Iraqis out of Kuwait and contain Saddam Hussein, one of the leading members of the coalition was Saudi Arabia. And because such an important Muslim country, remember the two holy places are there, this infuriated many Muslims, particularly the extremists who've been taking it out on Saudi Arabia and other countries, and certainly the United States, ever since. December 1992, a hotel in Yemen, often used by U.S. military personnel, is bombed. It is believed to be the first terror attack by Osama bin Laden. February 1993, 6 people die and thousands are injured in a bombing at the World Trade Center. It is the first attack by Muslim extremists in the U.S. 14 people are convicted in connection with the bombing, including Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, the blind Egyptian cleric who bin Laden and others have long regarded as an inspiration. December 1994, French commandos disrupt Algerian hijackers' plans to crash an airplane into the Eiffel Tower. The hijackers, the armed Islamic group, are credited with terrorist activities in Europe and Algeria. They are now linked to bin Laden's network. November 1995, 5 Americans are killed in a bomb attack on a U.S. military training center at Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. The 4 Saudi men convicted by Saudi Arabia confessed to being inspired by Osama bin Laden. June 1996. 19 Americans are killed and nearly 400 injured in the bombing of an apartment complex used by American servicemen at Dhahran in Saudi Arabia. The U.S. is still not certain who is responsible. November 1997. 58 tourists, mostly European, are ambushed and killed at Luxor in Egypt. The attack is blamed on one of the many Egyptian Islamic terrorist groups which are committed to overthrowing the Egyptian government and undermining American influence. August 1998. Suicide bombers simultaneously blow up the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. 257 people are killed and thousands are injured. Osama bin Laden is indicted in New York in what is believed to be the first suicide bombing by his organization. The U.S. retaliates with missile attacks in the Sudan and Afghanistan. October 2000, suicide bombers with ties to bin Laden rammed the USS Cole while it's at Aden in Yemen. The explosion kills 17 sailors and injures 39 more. For all these attacks by Muslim extremists, there are nearly as many attacks that were prevented by law enforcement. A plan to blow up a dozen airliners over the Pacific, an attempt to bomb the New York City subway and the Los Angeles airport, plots to blow up U.S. embassies in Egypt, India, and Italy, and plans to bomb U.S. targets in Jordan, Kuwait, and Yemen, all intercepted before they could happen. And then September the 11th, 2001. Since the 11th, there have been arrests made in 16 countries on 4 continents. In the United States alone, more than 600 people have been detained or arrested. When we come back, we'll take a closer look at Islam today. In the last month, you've probably heard a great deal about the Bush administration's attempt to put together an international coalition against terrorism. There are huge challenges and there are clearly some opportunities, but let me give you some isolated examples by looking at the map. Here in Jordan, the king is very much in favor of a war against terrorism, and in fact terrorists have been caught in Jordan before. The leadership in Syria, very uncertain at the moment. The United States would love to have access to the intelligence files in Syria because it would tell them probably a lot about terrorism in the region. But Syria is still on the list of those countries which the United States says supports terrorism. And by the way, Jordan and Syria have no love for each other either. We'll get back to Egypt a little later in the broadcast. There have been some changes in the Sudan. Osama bin Laden used to operate out of Sudan, but the Sudanese kicked him out. The United States and Sudan have cooperated a little more in the last year, though Sudan is still on the list of those states which the United States says sponsor terrorism. But it may be that Sudan is beginning to emerge from its isolated and violent past. And of course, it's one thing to have the leadership in these countries on your side, and another to figure out what it is that the people want. There's been so much talk about fundamentalism in the last few weeks, you might actually get the idea that the whole region is somehow mired in the past and that they all hate Americans. Well, here's a picture of the Muslim world you probably haven't seen yet.
الجديدة اللي دخلت للشارت طريقة واحدة لنعرف. Let's do the countdown from number 15 to number 6. من بعدها بنكون مع الهوت شوت tip of the week.
Here's a quick look at what's being broadcast on the Arab satellite stations these days, seen all over the Middle East.
Chicken Deluxe الدجاج وبيف ديلوكس فرنسي في ماكدونالدز.
The pharaohs left these people the pyramids. The Romans built cities. The American century has left its mark on the cradle of civilization.
You're not keeping that old wallet.
Why do you have such hatred for my wallet?
On the whole, I think it has brought people closer to the Western culture. It has inevitably led to the Western culture invading their lives in many ways and them happily embracing it.
Desmond Tutu, Dennis Ross.
This is the Arabic version of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire?
جوابني.
جواب صح صاروا 8000 ريال.
The U.S. influence can be seen everywhere. This is an American-style news broadcast for English speakers in the region.
From Al Manar Channel in Beirut, this is our news bulletin.
On a station owned by Hezbollah, the militant Islamic group in southern Lebanon known primarily for its kidnappings and its missile attacks on northern Israel.
Israeli enemy warplanes violated the Lebanese airspace Thursday for the 4th consecutive day.
It's Scottish Pride Day. I don't care if it's dressed like your Aunt Sally Day.
Of course, those who tire of Western fare or don't like it can switch on the daily prayer from the mosque in Baghdad on Iraqi television. But not many do. By far the most popular station in the region is the new 24-hour news channel which broadcasts from the tiny state of Qatar on the Persian Gulf. This is Al Jazeera.
I think it's really filled a void. Al Jazeera was there suddenly, providing people with impartial coverage, as much as that can be, of events taking place in their own region. Nothing became taboo anymore. You could speak of anything, of religion, of sex, of anything you could think of.
The slogan of the station is all points of view.
The significance of this on the leadership in the region is very big. They no longer feel that they can just do whatever they want and it will not be heard of.
Al Jazeera is the favorite station of nearly everyone now, from teenagers to Osama bin Laden. When he wanted to talk about the American airstrikes on Afghanistan, he gave the tape to Al Jazeera. At no other time in history has the Muslim world been connected like this.
لكن للأسف يا شباب حان الوقت أقول لكم باي باي.
As you travel across this huge swath of the Muslim world, through Iran, down into Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, come up here to Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, you find any number of people who have tremendous affection for the United States and admiration, too, who in many cases, if they can, send their children to come and be educated in the United States. They, as Muslims, wish to participate in everything that the 21st century has to offer. But they also have one other thing very much in common. That is a deep antipathy towards the United States for what they regard as its support of Israel in Israel's conflict with the Palestinians. Now, Israel has had more than its share of terrorism, more than its share of suicide bombers. But this conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is something that Osama bin Laden does everything he can to take advantage of. In the last year, the fighting between the Palestinians and the Israelis has left nearly 200 Israelis and almost 700 Palestinians dead.
We're not even aware in the United States of the magnitude of the suffering on the Palestinian side, although we understand and sympathize, of course, with the suffering on the Israeli side, which is much more familiar to us. And it's the impression of indifference to the loss of life by Arabs that has turned many from being warm friends into being, if not enemies, at least skeptics about the United States.
The Israelis believe they're defending themselves against terrorism. From a Muslim point of view, the damage and death inflicted by the Israelis on Palestinians only fuels the anger at America.
People say, listen, Israel would not be able to do what it does without America's military and political support. People argue, and this is, I mean, the dominant consensus in the region, regardless of whether they're Islamists or liberals or conservatives or even Christians for that matter. People say that Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon would not be able to really brutally crack against Palestinians if it's not, or if it was not for the green light from Washington.
The Bush administration in particular has kept a hands-off attitude. It has largely let Israel do what it has wanted.
But since September the 11th, the Bush administration has suddenly become more active. This has already resulted in a meeting between the Israeli Foreign Minister, Shimon Peres, and Yasser Arafat.
A number of Gulf leaders and officials called President Bush to say, finally, you get it. You understand just how serious this is and how this has to be a top priority. We need you to be active and to cool this down for our own stability.
Osama bin Laden would love for his words to incite massive street demonstrations like this one in the Palestinian territory of Gaza on Monday. The Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat, who has condemned the September 11th attacks on the U.S., sent his police in to break it up. It got out of control, which left Palestinians fighting Palestinians. Several demonstrators were killed, and Arafat is now being criticized by other Palestinians as a henchman for the American government. You don't have to go very far from the immediacy of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict to another enormous problem for the United States, which the Bush administration now has to manage. It's only about a footprint away on this map, a day's hard drive, say, from Jerusalem to Saudi Arabia. Herein lies 25% of the world's oil. Osama bin Laden was a Saudi citizen until they stripped him of his citizenship. Some of the hijackers on September the 11th were from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is enormously important to the West because of its oil, and it is most important to Muslims.
Allahu Akbar.
Saudi Arabia is home to the most important shrine in Islam. Devout Muslims pray 5 times every day in the direction of Mecca, where Islam's founder, Muhammad, was born. But Saudi Arabia as a whole is a cauldron of contradictions. Saudis practice one of the most austere and conservative forms of Islam, but it is also a country that has become fabulously rich in less than half a century, thanks to the discovery of oil. The U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia goes back to the early 1930s, when King Saud gave Standard Oil of California the right to prospect here. Every American president since Franklin Roosevelt has committed the United States to protect the Saudi monarchy from any external threat. The U.S.-Saudi relationship is clearly based on mutual self-interest, But here is the problem. Saudi Arabia is a virtual dictatorship, and the United States doesn't talk about human rights in Saudi Arabia, even though the State Department's own human rights report says that the monarchy in Saudi Arabia prohibits the establishment of political parties, suppresses opposition views, and prohibits or restricts freedom of speech, the press, assembly, association, religion, and movement.
How America treats the Muslim world when it comes to human rights is a big issue in the political imagination of Arabs and Muslims. They believe the United States wants dictatorships to remain in that part of the world because it gives it an easier access to exploit the resources of the region and also to dominate the area.
There's a lot of anger at this. There's a lot of feeling of, for some people, even betrayal that the U.S. is not standing up for its principles of freedom of expression and democracy.
There's a catch-22 in U.S. policy towards the Arab world. It's the following. On the one hand, as in every region in the world, we would like to see democratic regimes that respect free elections, human rights, right of free expression. And we are aware of the fact that regimes that repress their people tend to foment the kind of radicalism and violence that we see all too often. On the other hand, if those regimes were to open up, the short-term beneficiaries would almost certainly be those radical religious groups that we most fear.
The United States saw its problem in the region compounded a decade ago in the war against Saddam Hussein to liberate Kuwait and, incidentally, to protect the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. The U.S. and the Saudi royal family agreed that the kingdom could be used as a military launching platform to extend U.S. power in the region. U.S. forces are still there.
Using Saudi Arabian land, this was something that Islamists and regular people and even liberals in Saudi Arabia did not like at all. Kuwait was liberated, so why American soldiers stay there? They should go back home. And since then, and this is very significant, it is the first time in the Islamic history that foreign troops established themselves in the Holy Land of Arabia.
We'll continue our journey through the minefield that is the Muslim world in just a moment. In many cases, as we will see in the Muslim world, Islam is struggling with itself. Iran today is a good example. But in 1979, Iran was struggling with the United States. This is what Islamic militants across the region today would like to see happen in any number of countries. These were the crowds of furious, ordinary Iranians who rose up and overthrew the Shah of Iran. The Shah was, until then, America's staunchest ally in this region, until Ayatollah Khomeini decided he had to go. And because the United States was so closely aligned with the Shah, the anger turned against America after he fell. The Iranian Revolution was, as you'll remember, inspired by Ayatollah Khomeini, but it ultimately involved the whole nation. Certainly, many of them were very young. Here's another challenge for the United States today. In Egypt, the Egyptian leader Hosni Mubarak is pretty much on board the coalition. After all, Egypt gets about $2 billion in aid a year from the United States. But here again, we have an issue where the United States has a challenge dealing with a new generation. Throughout the Muslim world, more than 50% of the population, in some countries it's almost 3/4 of the population, is 25 or under. Egypt has a population of 70 million today. 55% are under 25. Many of them come to work or study in the intellectual capital of the Arab world, Cairo. It is a cradle of an ancient tradition, but Cairo is equally cosmopolitan and alive with modern ideas. We spoke to some students who voiced a range of responses to the events of September 11th. Some of them sounded measured and thoughtful.
I believe the people that did this are brainwashed. They don't know what they're doing. Maybe they're, you know, like the Nazis when they used to take children and train them and show them videos, and they were educated in a way to make them believe so and so. I believe the people who did this are like this.
Others find a longtime enemy to blame.
I think the Israeli Zionists did it, so they can turn the U.S. on the Arabs and Islam, so they can be free to do whatever they want in Jerusalem.
Many young Egyptians don't speak English. Many don't go to school. Millions are desperately poor and have no hope of being otherwise. It is not something that young Egyptians can easily seek to change through the political process.
Egypt is an authoritarian state. That is, all legitimate avenues of participation are controlled by the government. Youth between 16 and 25 have no way to participate in politics except, unfortunately, by going underground.
This thing called politics is dangerous. You go to a mosque, however, and there you find a community, and you're able to discuss things. A lot of these bottled up ideas and frustrations are given a breathing space in mosques.
Most young Muslims in Egypt take their religion seriously, and for the vast majority, it is a faith devoted to peace.
The twist, that's the interesting thing. It is the interesting juncture is when this private religiosity translates itself or transforms itself into a public act of defiance.
Egypt's recent history proves once again that Islam and politics can be a dangerous mix. In 1981, Egypt's President Anwar Sadat was assassinated by members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. 20 years later, that militant Islamic group's leader works with Osama bin Laden.
If you look at the history of some of the Egyptian perpetrators, you realize that some of them started as social activists in Egyptian universities. And the question is, what happened? How did the change really came about between social activism and then really, mass murderers? It's the perception that somehow there is no politics in Egypt. At the end of the day, Osama bin Laden and the militant Islamists care more about the political agenda than about Islam. Islam is being used and abused to really accomplish certain political goals.
Throughout the 1980s and the 90s, Egyptian Islamic Jihad and its rivals waged war on the regime of Sadat's successor, Hosni Mubarak. Nearly 3,000 Egyptians and scores of foreign tourists were killed before the extremists were driven from the country. Today, there are more than 15,000 political prisoners in Egyptian jails, many of them militant Muslims.
When the Egyptian Jihad and the Islamist groups were defeated by the Egyptian government by the end of the 1990s, some of them, like Ayman Zawahiri, who was one of the most trusted lieutenants of Osama bin Laden, they turned their attention from the local scene into the international scene. And indirectly, the Egyptian government, by doing what it's doing, it really has exported its own problem to the external environment. The Islamists turned their attention against Western targets, and American in particular, because it's very easy to mobilize and to recruit foot soldiers against American interests.
Egyptians are imbued with the culture of Islam, but very aware of the rights they are denied. If they continue to be denied a voice in their own society, the question is not where they will be tomorrow, but where will they be several years from now. When our broadcast continues, the United States and troubled Pakistan. Terrorism which the United States is trying to put together, there is simply no more important country at the moment than Pakistan, and the map tells the story. Pakistan right next door to Afghanistan, and a longtime supporter of the Taliban. Pakistan came into being as an independent country in the late 1940s after extraordinary turmoil and bloodshed between Hindus and Muslims, which of course involved India. The Hindu population which lived here fled to India. Much of the Muslim population in India fled to Pakistan. The violence was unbelievable. More than 1 million people were killed. Ever since that first convulsion between India and Pakistan, Pakistan has been an extraordinarily vulnerable nation. Pakistan literally means land of the pure. But in the more than 50 years since it was founded, the dream of a republic where Islam would thrive in all of its parts has not been realized. This latest crisis exposes Pakistan's many weaknesses, and the demonstrations we have seen are only a hint of the danger this country confronts.
There's enormous disillusionment here, largely because the elite here has come into power, elected into power, and then ripped off the state. Enormous corruption, enormous incompetence, enormous economic decline.
Even before all this happened, Pakistan was beset with really grave difficulties. It's essentially bankrupt economically. Its system of government has repeatedly failed. The army is really the only institution in the country that commands any respect, and even that is suspect.
This is a country where many of the schools are run by Islamic fundamentalists, where the most respected institution is the military, increasingly filled with Islamic extremists, and where the current president got his job after the last prime minister tried to have him killed. In the past 25 years, Pakistanis have lived through 2 military coups, 2 prime ministers convicted of corruption, another prime minister hanged, and a military dictator killed in a mysterious plane crash. Pakistanis have great reason to distrust those in power.
The main deniers of opportunity and privilege around the world in underdeveloped societies have been the local elites, who just raped and ravished and stole from their country until there was nothing left. And that's really the case in Pakistan today. There's nothing left to steal.
A third of the population lives in poverty. Even more lack access to health care or clean drinking water. Government funding for education has virtually ceased. And nearly half of Pakistanis, roughly 56 million people, are under the age of 15. 2% of the national budget goes to education.
The public education system in Pakistan has collapsed. And so the madrasas, the religious seminaries, funded by Saudi Arabia primarily, are taking up that slack. They're producing a breed of students who have no training, who have no skills in anything that is required in a modern society. They learn the Quran, they learn the Sharia, they learn things that are appropriate to the 11th century, but not what's needed for the 20th.
In the military, too, the effects of so much failure are beginning to show.
Over the years, the nature of the officer corps has changed, reflecting the changes in Pakistani society itself.
The new wave of young Pakistani soldiers has been encouraged to believe a more militant version of Islam. And because the military has so much power, division in the army threatens Pakistan as a whole.
We tried to bring moderation.
General Musharraf knows better than anyone that in the military, the Inter-Services Intelligence, the ISI, represents the greatest danger. The ISI is like the CIA, the FBI, and the Secret Service, all rolled into one. Hamid Gul is the former director of the ISI, and here is what he says about the United States since September the 11th.
They are using this great human tragedy, this very, very despicable event, to advance their strategic interest. They have a blueprint to rule the world for next 100 years. 21st century must belong to America.
General Musharraf's reaction to the challenge that President Bush gave him, which was to declare which side he was on, was probably the only correct response. But it's very, very risky for Pakistan. Very risky for Pakistan.
And perhaps you wonder what these pictures have to do with the story. This is trouble on the other side of Pakistan, high in the Himalayas, in a land called Kashmir. For 55 years, Pakistan has been engaged in a battle with India over this disputed region. Pakistanis believe that the largely Muslim population here should be a natural part of the Muslim homeland. And whenever Pakistan's General Musharraf needs to rally his nation, he doesn't turn to Afghanistan. He talks about India and the fight over Kashmir.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar.
Incidentally, whatever's been happening in Afghanistan, the violence in Kashmir has continued. In all these years, India and Pakistan have never been able to resolve their differences about this very small piece of territory. Why should we worry about that? Because Pakistan and India both have nuclear weapons.
Peter Jennings' reporting continues.
We said at the beginning that Afghanistan has been beset by war for much of the last century. It was sometimes known as the graveyard of empires. But why the United States and Afghanistan? After all, the United States helped the Afghans expel the Soviet Union from here. And there were certainly no Afghanis in the attacks on the United States on September the 11th. Part of the answer, of course, is Osama bin Laden. For Osama bin Laden, Afghanistan may have been the only place left to go. The roughness of the terrain and the weakness of the government made it a place where he could operate freely.
Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda are based in Afghanistan because the world forgot about Afghanistan. Afghanistan is not a government. It's not a state. It's a territory that has become the ground for schemes in movements that have nothing to do with the identity, the aspirations, or the rights of the Afghans.
For several hundred years, Afghanistan has been a strategic battleground for foreign powers. Even today, as Afghanistan unravels, the foreigners are maneuvering to take advantage. The Taliban has held on to power in part through its alliance with Osama bin Laden, clearly the most powerful foreigner in Afghanistan.
The Taliban have become increasingly dependent on bin Laden. The more they have been isolated from, the world and all the rest of it, bin Laden has provided them funding. He's provided them fighters, many Arabs. He's provided them contacts with the outside world of Islamic radicalism. This network of bin Laden has also been an economic network for the Taliban. They've provided enormous assets for the Taliban.
Bin Laden's troops are largely Arabs and other outsiders with no interest in Afghanistan itself. But from the beginning, the real source of the Taliban's power has been Pakistan.
The Taliban are not just an Afghan organization. The Taliban are an international Afghan-Pakistani organization. They have received military assistance, military training from the Pakistani military and intelligence services. There are Pakistani military advisors who play key roles in their planning activities, and according to many intelligence organizations, Pakistani regular troops have also come into Afghanistan to fight for the Taliban in key offensives.
Pakistan has always wanted a sympathetic government in neighboring Afghanistan, preferably one they could control. They already have a hostile neighbor to their east in India. And so Pakistan backed the Taliban. The Taliban also got support from Saudi Arabia, which saw in the Taliban a movement that would enforce Islamic law as strictly as the Saudis did. Many of the Taliban leaders studied in religious schools paid for by Saudi money. Saudi royal family stopped giving money a few years ago when the Taliban became too friendly with Osama bin Laden. But Taliban soldiers can still be seen speeding through the Afghan desert in pickup trucks that were a gift from their friends in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis were also trying to counter the influence of their traditional rival Iran, which borders Afghanistan to the west. The Iranians object to the Taliban's persecution of Shiite Muslims, which the Iranians are. Iran has given money and weapons to Shiites in western Afghanistan to fight the Taliban.
Iran nearly invaded Afghanistan, and Iran nearly went to war against Afghanistan in 1998 because Iran's version of Islam is diametrically opposed to the Taliban's version of Islam. Iran does not want to see the Taliban government survive.
The Russians have been supporting one faction or another in the civil war ever since the Soviet troops retreated from Afghanistan in 1989. They are also looking to back a winner. At the moment, Russia is inclined towards the Northern Alliance. When India supports the Northern Alliance too, it hopes the Northern Alliance will keep India's traditional enemy, Pakistan, off balance. And in case you thought there was no one left to get involved, don't forget China. The Chinese share a short border with northeast Afghanistan and have their own Muslim problem. China doesn't want its Muslims further infected by the Taliban's extremism. All of which leaves the United States trying to decide which faction to support in this fevered environment. The Northern Alliance is a questionable choice. Most of its leaders have a history of opportunism and brutality that makes them unlikely to win any popular support outside their own ethnic groups. Whatever the United States hopes to accomplish, the regional and ethnic and religious rivalries and the foreigners that have supported them have made Afghanistan a minefield all of its own. America may find that these divisions are the greatest obstacle to a lasting peace.
So perhaps our greatest contribution could be to keep other regional players out, to keep them from exercising too heavy a hand. The United States cannot rebuild Afghanistan, but as hopeless as it is, it's come to a level of hopelessness that allows hope. You're rebuilding from zero. And if the world community could get behind an effort after the Taliban's gone to help create a better rule of law Afghanistan, fundamentalist perhaps, but not extremist, not terrorist, where the people do have some self-determination, it would be a tremendous boon to the world because this whole region needs a success story.
This whole region does indeed need a success story. The trouble is that so many people define it in different ways. We'll have some final thoughts in a moment. Just before we leave, a couple of final thoughts. We recognize that an hour is only enough to scratch the surface of the Muslim world, and yet to learn some things. To understand that the majority of Muslims in no way tolerate what Osama bin Laden has done. To understand, too, that there's an accumulation of resentment about the United States and a deep desire on behalf of all Muslims that the United States would understand them better. A recognition, too, perhaps, that Islam is unsettled by the rush of modernity which marks the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century. And yet we also learn and recognize how many Muslims wish to take a greater part and enjoy the benefits of a more modern life. Challenges for the Bush administration, without question. Challenges for all of us. I'm Peter Jennings. Thank you for joining us. Good night.
This has been a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.
Tom Hanks in Apollo 13, ABC Saturday.
Watching the Associated Press News Station of the Year.